Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. Today's Jordan Peterson Thursday. It's delightful to have Roger and Victor leading the charge here. So, Roger, take it away.
Perfect. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Good. All right. Perfect. So thank you, everyone, for joining us once again. We're going to be covering Jordan Peterson's lectures on his Maps of Meaning book and theory. And today, the title is Becoming a Self. Just a quick recap. So in this lecture, we're going to actually start bringing all the ideas we've discussed so far together. We're going to be bringing back Genesis, which we've already gone through to some extent. And we're also going to be bringing back a lot of the ways of thinking and approaches that Peterson's kind of already laid out before. But before we get into all of that, let's go ahead and just get some general standards for what we're aiming at and what you should be prepared for. The main things that you'll need in your toolbox for this presentation is going to be the Genesis myth, as we've already covered, and the Cain and Abel myth, and kind of trying to remember if essentially the rationale that Cain goes into, because that's going to be the main point that Peterson really tries to hammer home at the end of the video, which is going to set up for the very last part of this 4-video lecture, which is essentially his argument for why evil is a lot more rational than most of us think or even want to consider. A couple of other things. I'll ask you to empty the word sacrifice and sin. We've talked about both of these, but sometimes they get very, it can be very hard to understand what the idea is if you're coming in with your own definition. For some people, sacrifice oftentimes associated with either something divine or important. Peterson tends to use sacrifice more as almost transactional. For example, you sacrifice your time to work in the hopes that you'll be paid and rewarded, right? And that for him is a sacrifice. And for sin, Peterson will oftentimes define it as to miss the mark. And that comes from both the Hebrew and Greek word, both that essentially are used as both a colloquially understanding of sin as like going against God, but that meaning of missing the mark is also going to be important because it also helps you understand a slightly different context of what it means to sin. For our goals today, we got 4 of them. The first is to understand the evolutionary origins of consciousness. This is just going to be one theory. It does not mean that this is the end-all be-all, but it's Jordan Peterson's point of view of how consciousness could have arisen, and also the role of self-consciousness and how it's played and what role it's played in our evolution. Finally, understanding the rational case that Cain has and why the spirit of Cain is likely to always exist with us as humans. And finally, understanding the rationality of why people would actively work against existence, which is going to be what we're going to close on. Slightly depressing topic, but one that I think is very, very important to really understand how Peterson thinks and how he gets to his ideas, but then 2, understanding his idea as a whole, as a balanced whole perspective of life and not just negative or positive. So to explain where we're going to be going today, we'll be essentially covering a lot of the things that we've already covered before. I made a mistake of assuming that Peterson wasn't going into as much depth as he normally would because he didn't have enough time because these are only 30 minutes. But it actually turns out he just was going to deliver those 2 lectures later. So some of the arguments that he gave in the video, you may have heard by me. So I'm sorry for spoiling that for you. But we'll be rehashing those, though I'll try to go faster through some of the stuff we've already gone over. The title of this lecture is Becoming a Self. So essentially, we're going to be discussing first where consciousness may have arisen from, and then what changes that adaptation or that change in consciousness and awareness would cause, And then we'll bring it to Genesis and discuss the story in terms of how it reflects our own reality. And finally, we're going to explore the problem that Genesis points out. That's an existential problem for all humans, and how that connects directly to evil. Essentially, for this approach, we're going to be mostly taking an evolutionary and slightly more rational approach, but we're going to start off in the exact opposite place, because that's where Peterson takes off, and I think it's fitting to understand where Peterson's going. So Peterson kind of starts us off with the symbol of snake and our interesting relationship with them. He points out that symbolically the snake has several associations. The first is that it's transformative, that snakes often shed their skin and are renewed as a consequence. And that symbol is a very common symbol for humans, not necessarily just the snake, but anything that can die and then be reborn, mostly because it's a perfect metaphor for how our psyches function, and essentially a metaphor for the maps whenever a map collapses and we have to create a new one. He points out that the snake as a symbol is also one that's horrifying. It was one of our main predators as we were evolving. And as we've discussed before, we are so trained to be able to actually detect snakes that if you put a stick in front of you and you're not, if someone puts a stick in front of you, or if you something that looks snake-like, you'll actually react even before your own brain registers that there's anything there. You'll jump away and you'll startle and orient directly towards that first. And Peterson also points out that they're also attractive. And what he means by attractive is that they attract your attention, whether you want it to or not. And again, Peterson's really obsessed with the orienting reflex, because the orienting reflex requires attention, and attention implies consciousness. And it's kind of where your consciousness has to be driven to. So the idea that when you see a snake, and even not just us, but primates, constantly it draws your sight line to it, and you have to keep an eye on it. But at the same time, you can't look away. And he also points out that the snake is not just our evolutionary competition, but we've also share an extremely distant relative. Our reptile ancestors, our reptile ancestors in the brain. So many of the parts that control our emotions have been dubbed the reptilian brain. And real quick, sorry, I'm going to switch headphones because I think my headphones are dying. Give me one second. All right, can you still hear me? Perfect. Sorry about that. But as I was talking about snakes and how they relate to us, a lot of the parts of the brain that's been associated with our emotions and how we react, and also considering the orienting reflex, and that is highly correlated with our emotional response and our very subconscious. The idea is that both us and all other mammals, essentially, or vertebrate mammals, share a part of the brain that's they have a section of the brain that's quite similar. And essentially, that part functions more as a system of emotion that controls aggression, sex, hunger. So those core sensations are kind of encapsulated within the reptilian brain, as Peterson points out. I was looking for a little bit of research, and there has been some argument, but the argument tends more to aim as to whether you can call it a reptilian brain, or was there other animals that also shared a similar structure. But for our purposes, Peterson kind of points out that you can imagine in ancient times that if you took a snake apart, it would look like its bone structure, and you saw its bone structure, it wouldn't be unreasonable to essentially say it's like, oh, well, that's just a brain and a brain and a spine. And it wouldn't be crazy to then also notice the exact same pattern that we have, that all the things that are connected mainly to the spine and then to the brain. And he's kind of points out that Kundalini Yoga, that there's this form of yoga that's Kundalini Yoga. And you see that one of the main purposes of that practice is to learn to access that reptilian system of the brain. As the purpose, and so I did a little bit of research on it, and the purpose is to this is all from Wikipedia, but the purpose is to tap into Kundalini energy, which in Hinduism is a form of divine feminine energy believed to be located in the base of the spine. It's conceptualized as a coiled snake at the base of the spine with the intent to bring a more alert state. So similar to how myths often describe a more phenomenological perspective or more how things feel or how things seem, that's also kind of how a lot of yoga is often taught, as in more what things feel like rather than a very specific scientific breakdown of it. But it can be described, and you can see it in this chart here at the very bottom. There's a little coil at the bottom of the spine. And the whole goal of all this is essentially to get that, or first metaphorically, to get the snake to uncoil and go through all the chakras all the way to the top one. Now, the purpose of doing that is to oftentimes attain a higher consciousness. And I will be honest, for a while, I didn't understand what that meant. I had heard some of my New Age friends say that, and it never quite made sense to me. I never quite understood what it meant. But here's what, at least from my understanding, it means. And the idea is that in the same way that the forbidden fruit of Eden is emblematic of consciousness expanding its awareness beyond previous limitations, Kundalini Yoga is an attempt to progress that awareness or alertness even more. Therefore, confronting what causes the problem as the source of the solution. And essentially, and Kundalini Yoga isn't the only one that functions to achieve this. It's the one that explicitly says that that's what their goal is. But they essentially have two goals, and I found these two goals very interesting. This is not Peterson. This is just something that I think is very relevant because he does talk about Kundalini Yoga. The first one is liberation from karma. So being aware enough to not be in constant correction for your actions and to be in harmony with the universe or God or reality. The second is the realization of Dharma, coming to terms with your destiny or life purpose and accepting your role. So with this general introduction, please keep these goals in mind as we dive into other traditions that as we dive into what other traditions have also stated problems with self-consciousness. But before we jump in too far, we should try and ground ourselves in a more rational narrative of where consciousness actually arrives. So leaving the symbolism and the traditions out for a moment, we're going to try to look at this more as in how could this actually happen without God or any of that stuff. So Peterson gives the example of a zebra grazing unconsciously, driven mainly by unconscious processes, when suddenly the eyes detect an anomaly. As it orients, the system of fight, freeze, or flight is activated. Since the predator has collapsed the previous map of known territory, the zebra is not aware of how to respond. So remembering where we are, where we want to be, and using your theory of the world to get to it, the idea here is that the zebra essentially eats unconsciously. It doesn't require consciousness. But the moment there's an anomaly, the zebra is now aware that they do not actually understand their surroundings. The map that they thought they had is completely incorrect, right? So now they're in chaos. As a response to that, all its cognitive resources are turned on in an attempt to create a viable plan for immediate action. Peterson's point is, at that point, when all things turn on at once, the zebra has become what we would consider conscious. It is processing information, judging, then choosing, all in real time, until the domain becomes predictable again, until essentially the zebra believes that they understand or they're in a domain that's more predictable. And that's what then shuts the system back down. But the reason it's not always on is because it's a high cost to maintain. It requires a lot of energy, it requires a lot of resources, and it puts a big strain on the system. The state is very expensive resource-wise. So what Peterson's main point here and what he's trying to elucidate is essentially that the idea here is that humans have that state of awareness that other animals can enter for a short term all the time. Our consciousness doesn't turn off. As a result, we are constantly assessing and predicting potential threats. Now, here's the rational problem with attaining that ability. It gives us a great ability compared to all others, but it also opens the possibility for a devastating realization. Our entire system is made to avoid unknown domains at all costs. In fact, that's actually what triggers those fight, flight, or freeze responses. Yet, our ability to share information and be self-conscious allows us to see that it's impossible to ever not have the unknown around us. We are doomed to face the very thing we evolved to avoid, and we know that fact. We know no map will ever be enough to solve the problems of our existence, yet without a map, we collapse into despair. As without a map, or more accurately, a hierarchy of values, nothing can be seen as meaningful. So now we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, our ability to be conscious has given us a massive advantage compared to all other life forms. On the other hand, it is that same advantage that allows us to essentially come to the conclusion that we're playing a losing game. Beyond the existential problem that this realization brings, there's a more immediate and direct problem that precludes it. That is maintaining yourself alive. You've evolved in every way to avoid death, and what helps you do that is acting in such a way to keep you alive. This self-awareness is also what makes you see just how difficult that actually is. The case can be made that this realization of vulnerability could have played a part in our evolution. Taking Peterson's previous point about women becoming self-conscious first, what would be the result of an animal realizing the dangers that it faces? So that's going to be where we're going to be going next. And essentially, it's going to be what happens once an animal is able to, I mean, maybe not fully, because who knows what that even means, but more accurately understand just how many different things could hurt it around it. So to consider this point, let's first consider the mating patterns of female chimps, who are close relatives evolutionarily. And Peterson points out something interesting and important, and that is that female chimps tend to not be very picky when it comes to choosing their mate. In their case, a lot of times the main determinant is the hierarchy, and especially the dominant male. Given the opportunity, female chimps will mate with other males and lower in the dominance hierarchy, and as long as it's outside of the view of the alpha. And the reason that they're interested in that is because if the alpha does find out, oftentimes, especially in chimps, the alpha will not punish the suitor, they'll scare the suitor away, but will attack the female. So there's a big incentive for her to not get caught mating, but it's also the main reason she doesn't mate with others. Given an opportunity where the alpha male isn't there, she's not very picky. Now, contrast that with mating habits for female humans. By comparison, human women are much more selective in their mating. Peterson's noted that the average response for a male proposition of female in the human species is, "Are you kidding?" Right? And, both, I think that's a pretty obvious realization. It's sex is hidden under so much more of a complex and cultural veil than just simple propositions. But that's going to actually be his point, because women became much more selective in what was allowed to reproduce. And here's the idea of, when an animal becomes aware, what would actually be the consequences of that? And when they became aware, practically speaking, they became the judges of what potential offspring came to actually exist. So it's important to ask, what was it they were actually selecting for? Peterson makes the case that one dimension that we know that women have selected for is that, unlike the chimps, unlike the chimps who mostly value males in high positions of the dominance hierarchy, partly because they're forced, but also partly because of protection, women will choose men who have a capacity to attain status, not necessarily people who have status. One good example would be the study that gives women 4 choices: useless rich, useless poor, useful rich, useful poor. And what women select for is useful. In other words, capacity to be able to do something of value. So the wealth and the resource, that stereotype doesn't quite track as well as many people would think. So as women get choosy, the men had to figure out what had to be done to be chosen, which leads to a virtuous cycle and an arms race of wits. The end result is, for Peterson, this is what explains our large expansion of the cortex and our frontal lobes, essentially. And it also creates a battle. And this is also helps explain why women are oftentimes associated as nature, because essentially they are both, and more of the feminine, they are both the judges of what humans actually end up being and look like, because they are the ones that actually select which male gets to reproduce, and not all males do. And also a benevolent temptress in the sense of when you are selected. So 2 different examples. To be rejected by all women is to be rejected by nature itself, right? As a man, to constantly try to approach women, constantly offer what it is you believe is of value, and have them constantly give you the exact same feedback of no, is to be rejected by nature itself. And Peterson himself has commented on, for example, the incel movement as, if all the women you know are rejecting you, if all of them, it's probably not the women who's the problem, right? It's actually you that has the problem, and you should probably figure that out. But then the reverse of that, to be enticed by women, is to be doing something right by nature, because that is what is being promoted. That is what is being pursued, right? And this may be part of the reason why in the hero stories, which is the ideal behavioral profile that we see, that the reward for the hero oftentimes isn't just gold or resources, but also a virgin, or in other words, approval of nature. In other words, a guarantee that they will continue their offspring, continue through offspring. So now that the case has been made in more non-mythical terms, let's just jump back to the myth of Genesis with this context in mind. The point being to go through it, but this time attempting to use more secular evidence, and to kind of see the association with consciousness and how that all would play out with this background of women becoming choosy, of women becoming conscious first, and how consciousness could have evolved. So at its core, Genesis is an attempt to understand through drama and metaphor what the human condition is. And Peterson notes that we seem to be the only beings who are at odds with our existence. And it's not an unreasonable argument to point out that no animal even comes close to our cognitive abilities. Yet those cognitive abilities seem to be the source of great suffering. We suffer not just for what is currently happening, but also for what has happened and what will happen, and even what may happen. All of this is brought on by self-consciousness. So Peterson believes that the forbidden fruit is a representation of self-consciousness, and especially of vulnerability and specifically of death. And he offers several points of evidence for this. The first is the parallels between the Buddha myth and Genesis, in which the encounter with awareness of the self is the cause of the collapse of the status quo. Essentially, realizing just how vulnerable you actually are collapses the status quo, and it can never be returned to, and therefore you must build a brand new way of life, essentially, for both Buddha and Adam and Eve. He also points to representations, medieval representations of Adam and Eve in which Eve is offering Adam a skull rather than a fruit. And there's also representations, as the one I put on this slide, of the tree of knowledge as not having fruits, but skulls. I've seen other versions where it's a normal tree, but then the fruit itself is actual skulls. And it's this idea of knowledge of death. And Peterson then also points to the actual text or story itself. And these are a couple of points that he points out as to why you can conceptualize the forbidden fruit as self-consciousness. And one is walking with God. So according to the story, Adam walked with God prior to his original sin. This can be conceptualized as the fact that at some point in our evolutionary history, we were much more like animals than what we are like now. In that state, we'd be mostly unconscious, much like the zebra we discussed previously, and we'd be inhabiting a domain of similar value. In other words, one that is beyond good and evil. We wouldn't have, or philosophically, you wouldn't normally make the case that we would have been moral creatures, right? If we have no consciousness and self-awareness, we're kind of just following our impulses. In the same way, we don't really get mad at a lion from killing a zebra, because it's like, yeah, that's kind of what they just do. That would also apply to us. We wouldn't really have that active choice. But through the story, it conceptualizes a transition. And though the story conceptualizes this transition as instant, it doesn't have to be the case. It's kind of the same result, as long, we still end up with the same result. At some point, we weren't self-aware, but now we are. And it's important to understand here that in that state prior, there would be no difference in harmony between the rest of the world and us. In the same way that we would be beyond good and evil, we would be a part of the entire ecosystem in a unconscious, non-choosing way. In the way that, for example, when we talk about nature, or when the fact that I say nature, a lot of times you can conceptualize a bunch of different animals, but you're not considering them as individuals. You're not considering them as how they felt that day, or how they were brought up, or what experiences they had as defining features of them. That's not quite what we mean. So that would then also apply to us. And that's the idea of us being in unison with the transcendent, with the divine, with the totality, with God, with reality, whatever, different conceptualization you want to use. And you can also see the difference that once you become self-conscious, we also tend to see ourselves as different or separate from nature, or different or separate from everything else. If we didn't, we wouldn't care that we died, right? Like if we didn't actually identify ourselves as separate from the world, then the fact that we die is an irrelevant transition. The next thing that Peterson also points to is the knowing that they're naked, of Adam and Eve. And the quote is, "And the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." To know that you're naked is to be aware of yourself as vulnerable. The very fact that it's the consumption of the fruit that's the catalyst for the psychological transformation of awareness of their naked condition directly connects the fruit with self-consciousness, right? It's that exact moment when they eat the fruit that is that is what gives them the ability to even become aware of their own vulnerability. And as a result of that change, God comes and once again to walk with Adam, but Adam is afraid to present himself to the divine, which brings us to the question, why would Adam then fear God? And to know that, we should recall what Adam represents in the greater context of the story. Adam, like all other things in the world, is in harmony with everything prior to eating the fruit. And humans, the whole, as he made the case a couple of lectures ago, that humans have a connection with God through the logos. Like God, we can create realities out of potential. It's the divine spark. And Peterson loves to say that it is actually the idea of the logos, the idea that we are a part in some way divine, that is what actually justifies our human rights. And that's what it's resting on. It's more of a claim of fate that is just kind of taken at its value, but is something that has to kind of just be believed. And it's also the very thing that is the relationship between the finite and the infinite, right? That like you essentially have two different things of divinity, one that is infinite, all-knowing everywhere, and then us as this weird, unique being in the context of the canon of the story. And the divine connection, according to the story, is eradicated by the dawn of self-consciousness, implying that something happened that prevented that connection to continue. And this is kind of similar to what we alluded to before, that unconscious state to conscious state. And it can be explained through more an evolutionary perspective, but you can imagine that before we understood evolution or anything like that, we could look at other animals and be like, well, likely at some point we were something more like them. And Peterson also asks us, for the sake of argument, to consider, why would anyone shy away from God now that we understand that divine connection? And he talks about one of them in this lecture, and he talked about two of them in a different lecture. So I'm going to go through all three because I think they're all really important. But the first is, he asks us to imagine that you have a destiny, a role that you're to play in the grand scheme of things. You can also consider that Adam would be fulfilling his destiny prior to eating the fruit, right? That prior to becoming conscious, the processes that he would be doing would just be his destiny. Just like if you have an animal and you just leave it there and assuming that destiny does exist, well, the animal wouldn't fight its own destiny. It's also worth remember that Kundalini Yoga goal that was mentioned earlier in the beginning, that a little bit of consciousness allows you to not follow your destiny, but an extended amount of consciousness. And essentially one of the goals of that form of yoga is to come to terms with your destiny, to understand and accept the role you play in life. And Peterson points out that one reason you may stray from your destiny is that you're self-aware of your vulnerability. An example is, if your destiny is to be hurt or to die, you may not be very fond of that, and therefore may choose an alternative, right? If what they tell you is that this, something has happened, and because of that, your destiny is to be burned at the stake, but don't worry, it's what you were meant to do, you might have some opinion or something to say about that. Peterson also points out that because Adam is aware that he is divine, he's also becomes aware of his vulnerability. It's that realization of his flaws and shortcomings that is the result of him feeling unworthy of walking with God. How can he be identified with something transcendent when he's, as Peterson notes, susceptible to social alienation, has a body that essentially is terrifying and constantly degenerating, will eventually decay into old age, and is bound by death? How could I be good for anything? How could I even believe myself that I'm divine? But Peterson also says something else that's pretty deep, but also a lot more psychoanalytic. And that is the tendency to not show our best for the very same reason. And you can imagine this as if you half-ass something, if you don't actually put your entire effort into something, but you put it out for judgment, you give it to your peers, you give it to your work, or even you put it up for God, and they tear it apart. They don't like it, they hate it, they tell you it's terrible. You may be a little hurt, but you can excuse it as, I wasn't even trying, right? In reality, you've protected yourself by not showing yourself. But if you truly do your best that you can do, and you put it out to others, even to God, to judge you, they are truly judging you, right? You are truly putting yourself in a vulnerable position, because if you do the best that you can, and that judgment is still negative, there's nowhere to go from there. The judgment is a judgment on the true you, on the core you, naturally from their perspective. So they may just not like you, but it is a true judgment. You can't hide and say you didn't try. You can't hide and say you could have done better if you really do put that up. The story is making the case that human self-consciousness was the event that had cosmic significance and changed our species to something very different from everything else. In addition, there were prices to pay for acquiring this awareness. And that brings us to a couple of biological facts about human beings that fit quite nicely into the Genesis story. But because, as Peterson put it, once you wake up, sorry, you're awake. You can't go back. So Peterson argues that the ability to become self-conscious is anatomically related to our species having a massive expansion of the cortex. So in order for that expansion to happen, our skull sizes had to grow. And in order for our skull sizes to grow, it would mean that we would have to increase or at least women would have to increase the pelvic diameter girth in order for them to be able to give birth to humans that have bigger skulls, which Peterson points out that by now we're at our structural limit. The pelvic diameter can't grow any further without compromising the woman's ability to walk and run. So there was one last trick evolution used, and that was that as the pelvic diameter is pushed to its limits, babies were born at shorter gestation periods. Mammals of our size should have a gestation period of about 2 years, but instead we have one of 9 months. We have to give birth before the skull becomes too big. And these are the same realities that you can see reflected on our story when it comes to how God punishes the sexes and how God punishes Adam and Eve. Because for the women, God says, and to the woman, he says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. What does that mean? Well, first, it's a tight fit and high mortality. As a result of the process we just described, human birth is very intense and until recently, very dangerous. Baby skulls are squeezed and have evolved to compress during childbirth to the point where they can be visibly deformed temporarily. And that's what this photo is, right? That even pushed all the way to the limits, even giving birth way earlier than what would be for a child that would be more like a 2-year-old. The baby still has to also essentially fold its head just to get that big brain out of the woman. The other one is fetal children. Since babies are born much earlier in their development, they are much more dependent and vulnerable on the mother than other animals. Additionally, as a result, the child's existence is at great risk early on in their lives. As Peterson notes, that's a very common trope in the hero's myth. You know, you can think, for example, Harry Potter and Voldemort randomly showing up and trying to kill him in the crib. There's this constant theme of at the start, things were very dangerous. Why? Because they are for almost all humans. And you can imagine all you need to do is go back 100, 200 years and imagine what human life is like. And yeah, more than likely when you're really young, life is very hard and you likely are very lucky if you make it to older age. But it also means that since they are so vulnerable, it means that the child is fully dependent on the mother. This then places a very unequal burden on the mother and greatly increases her vulnerability in a wide variety of things. And to quote the Bible again, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Peterson notes that this isn't necessarily a command, but rather just a description of a natural condition that humans find themselves in. Due to the increased vulnerability, risk, and resources that are required to give birth and raise a child in the world, there's an adaptive strategy to entice a man for protection, help, and resources, which means you have to deal with men, which should be noted is marked as a punishment because who would voluntarily would want to do that, right? Like it's not an easy, it's not an easy thing to have to deal with men, especially in the times that we're currently talking about. And what are then the costs for men? Well, quoting again, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shall thou eat of it for all days of thy life. Essentially, we're going to work, and we're going to work because we know what the future has in store. We know what's coming, and it's dangerous, right? And we have to prepare. But there's that dark twist. We know that no matter how much we prepare, we still face the very thing we worked so hard to avoid. Pain, suffering, and eventually death. They're unavoidable, even though we can't help but try our best to avoid them. From here, Adam and Eve give birth to the first self-conscious humans who are born outside of the way of God. And what's their story? What do they look like? Well, as you can tell from the painting, not great. Because, and you can think of this as a kind of a mapping of what the human condition is. You can essentially say, okay, so these are the first of men. These are the people that were born that, essentially actually have belly buttons, are born from humans. What do they find out about life? Well, they work as they're cursed to do. Abel tends to sheep, Cain farms, but then they discover something else. In the story, we find that they discover another issue with this new existence outside of God's guidance. Not only must you work and sacrifice just to survive, but sacrifices don't always work, and it's not always clear why. So essentially, you work in the hopes that your work will result in a better future. The point of work is to turn the transcendent into the benevolent. This is the benevolent mother versus devouring mother trope, right? That if you're willing to sacrifice enough, you can convert something that would normally be dangerous into something that can be helpful. And essentially, the way it seems to work is you work and sacrifice, and then you ask if it's enough. You ask the world, or you ask God, or you ask whatever, and then pay attention to if things change or not. And whatever answer the transcendent gives you, that is the answer. In other words, if you want something and you work really hard to do it, and then the world doesn't give it to you, you didn't do enough. And this applies even now, right? If, let's say, like, I want to do grad school, but I don't ever do anything to do about it, or I half-ass my application and don't really try. And then I'm like, hey, I did it. Why am I not getting in? Well, the reason is because the sacrifice wasn't enough. The thing that was given up wasn't enough to actually get you the thing that you desired. So that problem that sacrifice doesn't always work, that is at the core of Cain's spirit. Because as the story goes, Cain essentially realizes this when his sacrifices do not yield the results he wants. And God tells him, hey, if you sacrifice correctly, you'll be rewarded. In other words, do what I want, and you'll be rewarded. And God here is a representation of everything outside of us, essentially, right? Everything else. And then he says, then when Cain complains, he says, no, sin lies at your door like a cat in heat, and you invited it in and essentially had sex with it. And it's a weird line, but essentially what is trying to be communicated there is that there's a tempting aspect to sin. There's that tempting aspect to not sacrifice what's actually necessary to achieve what it is that you want to achieve. And that in doing that, in falling into that enticement, you are engaging with it in a creative manner. You are creating something that is, in a way, destructive. And it's worth considering that sin here can also mean to miss the mark. And if the correct way to adapt so that things go the way you want them to is conceptualized as what God wants, then to sacrifice the correct things is to relinquish something of value to better improve your ability to attain other things that you value. To refuse to change, even when the world is showing you your mode of being is not functional, can therefore be seen as sin. Essentially, if your strategy isn't working, by definition, you're sinning because your own strategy isn't achieving what it is you would want. You are missing the mark in what behavior you should be exhibiting. And it may be because you're not willing to sacrifice enough of what you think is important. Now, Victor will be diving into the spirit of Cain in a few, but before we do that, it's also worth considering the perspective taken on in many Hebrew narratives. And that is that the fault is always us, never the divine or reality. If the world isn't lying itself out in a way that you find acceptable, you're faced with a tough choice. It's either the world that's wrong or you. If it's you, then you should find out where you've sinned, what's wrong, where you missed the mark, where you didn't act accordingly, and change accordingly until your sacrifices are rewarded. If it's the alternative, and it's the problem that the world is actually what's wrong, you have a much bigger problem, as we're going to find out. Victor, would you like to jump on?
Sure. Thanks, Roger.
Oh, sorry.
All right. It could be slightly repetitive, but only to make a point at the end and to establish the point and to explain the point. So just to recap Adam and Eve's story, and before that, a Genesis story, it all started with nothing, and then God separated light from darkness, and right after that, it goes to create the whole nature, and then he creates Adam and Eve, who are the first humans, and they are given everything in the Garden of Eden. And at this point, they are told to follow a particular restriction. And that restriction gets broken by the first humans, Adam representing the great culture, the great father, Eve representing the nature, the great nature, and the great mother. At this point, God comes back, yells at them, and they are thrown out of Garden of Eden. So that's the narrative perspective. Now, to look at the same story from a metaphorical perspective, what we really have is the first humans, when they were created, they are more or less unconscious beings. They don't know what a good or what a bad is. Then they go find the tree that gives them the knowledge of good and evil. That moment they become conscious, and then they are out of Garden of Eden. They are in a real world now. At this point, we know that they have the knowledge of good and evil. And the very next story determines what good and evil is. For that, let's quickly dive into Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve, the first humans, or representing great mother and great father, great culture and great nature, they give birth to two sons. And they grow up and they get their responsibilities. And here it goes. And Abel was the keeper of sheep, but Cain was the tiller of ground. And in the process at time, it comes to pass that Cain brought the fruit from the ground, offering to the Lord. Essentially, as Roger was pointing to, it's the idea of working. Working, what does work mean? We have an objective to go to, and we put in our efforts, we use our time, we use our energies. At any point of time, we have multiple things to do, but to achieve something, we sacrifice the other things, focus on the thing that we need to achieve, and we go ahead. That's the idea of working, essentially sorting out our priorities. And what happens next? Abel also brought his firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect to Abel and his offering. As Roger was pointing to, the idea of the results show what kind of work we put in, and they speak to us back, telling that either the sacrifices or the work that is fruitful or not. And in a way, God did not accept Cain's fruits. He is also saying, if you just got your act together, your results would have been accepted. If you got your act together. Cain is not happy, and again was very wrath that his countenance fell. So he's not happy, he's frowning. We can relate the same thing to ourselves. Whatever we try to achieve, if we succeed, we are happy. If we do not succeed, we go into all kinds of negative emotions like frustration, hurt, anxious, feeling ashamed and feeling guilty, and all of these things. It's a very relatable feeling. If we look at it right, if we try to dissect this exact feeling, so here is what it looks like. If the world isn't laying itself out in the manner that I find acceptable, now I have a couple of ways to think about it. Either to say, okay, the things that I've done, the sacrifices that I've made are not enough. So I'll change my ways and I'll go attempt it again. Or we can see that I have done everything right, only that the world outside, so that is a terrible place, and that is against me. The world is a terrible place. It is bent for my destruction. Everything, the game that we are playing is completely against me. So I can go in that route. If I go in that route, there are so many problems, which means if I take that idea and look further, meaning to think that I did everything right and the problem is outside of me, what can I get? Rationally speaking, we can go and eradicate that problem. So I can think of like, why not I just go out and whatever that is causing the problem, why don't I just get rid of that one? It could be the other person, the other set of people, or the culture, or the idea, anything that is outside. I can have that kind of rationality. And I can think that, okay, that would resolve the problem. But actually, Cain does the same thing. He just goes and eradicates the comparison part, which is Abel, and he is still left with the problem, and we will be left with the same problem. The problem of we not having that happiness, we not not getting rid of that resentment, that unfulfillment, and all those things. And then the next step would be, all this is happening to me, and I am still feeling the problem. I'm still facing the pain and suffering. What's the next step? The next step would be, why not I just end the thing that is suffering? That would be me. So that would be the next step. So it's a slippery slope from there. And this second part is explicitly discussed in this play, Faust by Goethe. Goethe, it's a play, I'll present the premise of the play. The narrative of Faust begins in heaven. While angels worship the Lord for his creation, Mephistopheles, the devil, complains about the state of affairs in the world. He claims the mankind is corrupt, and he revels in the evil and disaster that he is able to cause. Mephistopheles makes a bet with the Lord that he will be able to turn one of his good servants, Dr. Faust, over to sin and evil. The Lord agrees, claiming that Faust will remain a loyal follower. And now here you can see the resemblance to the story of Job from Old Testament. And who is Dr. Faust? To look at his character, so he's 60 years old. He is a very smart person. He's well learned. He's a scholar. But he's unfulfilled in his life. He doesn't have much money. There's no power. There's no love. There's nothing going on in his life. He feels like he's sterile and pointless. So he feels his life is pointless. He even wishes he could die. Then Mephistopheles enters into his world and tempts Dr. Faust to sell his soul, the soul that he is, who is actually following the good path. If he sells his soul to him, to Mephistopheles, he will give him everything that he wants in his life. So that is the premise of the play Faust. And in order to tempt and to get the soul of Dr. Faust, he goes in and he persuades him by saying, this is one of the quotes from the play, follow the adage of my cousin Snake. From dreams of godlike knowledge you will wake, to fear in which your very soul will quake. And this particular play has two parts, and in the first part, it goes on to say, the spirit eye that endlessly denies, and rightly too, for all that comes to birth, it is for overthrow as nothing worth. Wherefore the world were better sterilized. Thus, all that's here as evil recognized, to gain to me and downfall, ruin, sin, the very element I prosper in. He goes on to make the same point again in the part 2 to say, gone to sharing nothingness, past with null made one. What matters are creative, endless toil. When at a snatch oblivion ends the coil, it is bygone. How shall this riddle run? As good as if things were never had begun. Yet circle back existence to possess. I'd rather have eternal emptiness. This is a way to tempt him to say that whatever you are doing in this world is not working. So why to exist? Why don't you just give up? So this actually, in a way, that's the danger of rationality. So when we are suffering and when we don't see the problem in ourselves, then the existence itself feels like it's a mistake and unneeded. And the alternative looks like a tempting offer.
Thank you, Victor. That's great. So, as covered by both me and Victor, the case that maybe this game isn't worth playing is at least biblically found to originate in the first generation of humans who must live the life their parents cursed them to. To best understand the case for why someone may knowingly go against God or even against good, Peterson asks us to imagine that your life isn't going well. And more importantly, that the reason things aren't going well for you is because you're arrogant, you're stubborn, you're quasi-totalitarian, you're cowardly, you're an idiot, and that's why life is crashing down on you. Your own invisible flaws that you choose to ignore. And as mentioned earlier, you can have 3 responses. You can change, in other words, become self-aware, realize what you're doing, or realize where it's going wrong, or at least attempt to adapt. You can continue doing that and be surprised again. As we've talked before, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, although many people often do. Or the third option, which is to become resentful. And as Victor highlighted with Faust, there's that pull to your own destruction. And Peterson goes even further to say it's not even just that, it goes further than that. And what he points to is that if you become resentful, then what happens is that rather than seeing those who are succeeding and attempting to imitate their strategy, the aim becomes to hate those who have succeeded and view the world as unfair, and particularly unfair to you. The problem is not you and your unwillingness to adapt to your reality, but rather it is the world, society, or even God that is against you, which leads to an important question. What's the logical response to such a conclusion? Our minds are evolved to believe our maps, the idea of what we conceptualize as how the world works. As covered before, we have adapted to use our system of known and unknown territories, with unknown territory as the thing to be avoided at all costs. However, self-conscious beings, we are aware of just how far the unknown territory expands. We know that no matter what map we make, we will die. Knowing that shatters our current structure. You can see this through a possible religion that you were raised in, that you may have lost, or if you ever had a crisis of faith. But self-consciousness can do worse than that. It can destroy your belief in belief structures, so that no matter what belief system you attempt to erect, the self-conscious awareness of your vulnerability invalidates and collapses it into nihilism. It doesn't matter what you believe if you end up dust to dust like everyone else. Yet, in that void of meaning, there's something that cannot be ignored. Life is still suffering, even if it's nothing else. We suffer, get sick, then die. Innocent children everywhere suffer. All of us are aware, if we allow ourselves to be, that everything that we value and care about will end. How is it right to allow this state of affairs to continue? Perhaps it would be better if all things considered, this game was brought to an end. And in that worldview, what solution remains? It is here that the spirit of Cain can be found. The view that the pain of existence isn't worth it. That would be better to have never existed. And if that is the axiom that you are taking as true, then what behavioral profile does that lead to? I put the image of the Columbine shooters, partially because on the recommendation of Peterson, I've read their manifestos. And if you want to see exactly what Peterson's talking about, I highly recommend to everyone, but be forewarned, they are very dark, but they make that point. And Peterson closes the same thing I'm going to close with, going back to Iliada and the comparison of myths. Why is it that societies fail? And it's twofold. The first is they naturally decay on their own accord. Any system, any complex system that's created naturally decays. But then the second reason is that human structures can be expedited the human structures, the decay of human structures can be expedited when the participants either stop seeing the purpose in maintaining it, or worse, work to destroy existence and return to the non-consciousness state prior to our birth. Essentially, that nirvana that the Buddha was tempted with. And that's going to set us up perfectly for the next one, which is going to be directly about evil and how it can manifest. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks, Victor. So folks, we're now going directly into the breakout rooms to discuss everything that we've heard. And then we come back with both our takeaways and questions. All right, so you can either talk about your takeaways or your questions or both. I posted the rules for breakout rooms in the chat. I'm going to put them again in the breakout rooms as soon as the breakout rooms start. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. They're going to run for 20 minutes, and then we'll be back here automatically or automagically to talk about our takeaways and questions. See you soon. Give me a second here. All right, welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, everybody's back. So now it's time for takeaways and questions. So you can talk about just your takeaway, just your question, or takeaway and question. So your 4 rules, as always, go ahead and type exclamation mark to speak. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, speak your mind. Disagree with anybody you want on anything, and do so courteously. All right, who'd like to go first? It's going to be, you have to type exclamation mark to go. And then Victor and Roger would get to respond to anything that is said as we go along. So it's going to be Joe, Lizzie, and Jean. Joe, go ahead.
All right, I'm going first because nobody else is going. So,
I really appreciate that, Joe, always.
I'm just taking my shot because I didn't have a moment to gather.
Odd. It's very odd. It's like when things get started, then they get started. It's always hard to get things started. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I'm here to make other people feel comfortable. So once I go, yes, one of the discussions that we talked about is the idea of suicide, and in our breakout room, and what actually causes somebody, this is a question, what causes somebody to either take out their anger on the rest of the world or take out the anger on themselves and just end their own lives. So the Columbine shooters who'd make this decision to hate being, itself, and that they think that, as Roger has read, and I know he's answered this question in one way, shape, or form in the past, but the idea that, they said, do away with all the animal, or leave the world to the animals, that human beings don't belong on the face of the earth. What causes somebody to take that approach versus being turned in on themselves? There are a couple takeaways that I'm trying to gather my notes on really quickly with the presentation itself, as far as what women value in men as far as security, and maybe just go into a definition of what security really is. Has that evolved over these generations? Security is could be food and eating, but what's security at this point? And in this world, in modern society, it means something very different. So that's just a takeaway that I am thinking about in general. So, but the first one's an actual question. I have other things, but I'm just going to let somebody else go at this point.
Sure. Roger, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, so I can answer both real quick. So the first one is the reason that, at least for the Columbine, and it changes a little bit, but essentially it always falls to something similar, is almost a sense of entitlement. To say that life was unfair is to presume that you were promised something that was, right? It's to assume that life in some way owed you something. And this idea, like if you read the Columbine, he'll talk about raping his classmates. He'll talk about shooting and planning to kill them and how they all deserve it and all these ideas, but they always are from the perspective of, I am better than all of you and you are all blind to my greatness, right? It's that incapacity to turn that same critical eye at yourself. It's that incapacity to be like, hey, things aren't going great. Why? And not just look for things, but be like, hey, maybe I'm the one that's doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. Maybe I'm the one that's, you know, doing something that isn't a great way to get what it is that I want. But it's that idea of flipping it. As for the other one, as far as women valuing security, I don't know if women necessarily always value security, but the idea is more that, I mean, I think all humans value security to some extent, right? Just staying alive. And in the biblical sense, I think I know what part you're referring to when, you know, there is an increased vulnerability. You can even just see the problem here, for example, with single moms, that like, it obviously can be done and it can be done very successfully. It is not easy, right? It's not even easy even if you do have two parents. It's like raising any child is not an easy task, mostly because they're kind of dependent on you until they're 18, which is a massive commitment. It's about like on average a quarter of your life of a commitment just to like bring this human to a full grown adult. So, but as far as what they value, it's more the ability to climb in the hierarchy. And the reason it's so obscure is because climbing in the hierarchy can change and adapt depending on what is needed within the current environment, right? So if what is currently needed is some, you know, someone that's successful or something like that, then the hierarchy highlights that and elevates that, or the hierarchies, because there's multiple hierarchies constantly always being played out.
Wonderful. So what we'll do is that, you know, the format is that you give your takeaways, ask your question, and then Roger or Victor will respond to it. And then we'll just go on to the next person. That way we can cover as many people as possible. All right. Next up is going to be Lizzie, Jean, and David. Lizzie.
Yeah, I actually have a question. Well, first, I really appreciate the discussion in the breakout room because everybody brings in very good idea, and then I think that some of them might like to talk a little bit about. But my question is more related to, you know, just what Roger just mentioned about, you know, don't be entitled. And in fact, when I first got out from school, get my first job, and then my boss, one of my bosses, the advice that he told me was, don't be entitled. Okay. You might think that is very funny, but because I got a very high degree, and then he feels like people like me or people who came from my school tend to be entitled, which mostly I agree. The second advice that I got from another boss is actually to be self-aware of how other people perceive you. So I think this is closely related to what we're talking about today, right? And then my question is actually, when I try to be as careful as enough, you know, to look at myself and to, you know, observe how other people perceive me, you know, the reaction when I talk, when I, you know, say something or whatsoever. And I find out that like, it's not very easy for people to be self-aware. And sometimes you can tell that because they do not have this capability, and then they keep failing in the society, or even in, you know, interacting with other people. They may not be able to get the social cues that like ordinary people can get, and that's why they cannot. They may not be able to get a signal, and then they may not even be able to see that they're failing. So I'd be very curious. Like, it seems being self-conscious or self-aware is not something we automatically equipped when we're born. So which part that actually caused this issue that for some people they're probably super confident, or they don't even realize like, oh, the stuff like their behaviors are actually not likable or something like that, and how can we actually help them? Because I would like to see what techniques I can learn so I can be more aware of, you know, my behavior, and then we you know, just like to be more successful when I try to interact with other people as well.
Roger, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, but I unfortunately I'm trying to think of anything that I would know that would help with that. But I do agree that there, simply because we have the capacity to be self-conscious doesn't mean we actually practice it, right? Like simply because we have the capacity to conceptualize, understand our vulnerabilities, our deaths, like all these things, that doesn't mean we actually have to use them. And I think for a lot of people, a lot of times it's just there's no need to. I mean, I'm no professional, but one of the advice that I would probably work best is just being able to share your insights, because it just in sharing your own vulnerability and your own insights, it kind of frames it as, well, that's what I do, which then leads to the question of like, well, what about me? What do I think other people think of me, right? Or just kind of like more showing and then allowing them to do it themselves.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jean, David, and Brian Nelson. Jean.
Yeah, we have a great discussion. I think I also have the question about what Joe also mentioned. I think it changed what women need. As a woman, I think Jordan Peterson, maybe we need more women psychiatrists or philosophers to study, because they really understand what women need. Because I don't think women need security for sure, because they have to have kids. And like you said, the raise the kids take a lot of effort. But I don't believe hierarchy no longer, maybe in a more basic countries, like very poor country, that's what the basic requirement to have physical food and all this lodging, all these things. That's why you see in those countries, even in China now, also the country with big gap between the rich and poor, they usually men have multiple women and some men have no women. The reason is because those men can afford all these women. The man, with them, you cannot make a living. But in a more developed country, actually that's no longer the case. So in that case, people don't actually think hierarchy is the most important thing, but the security, emotional security, maybe is more important. That's what I observe. And also, I think for the women who don't really very capable to make a living or have a career, they definitely need someone can make money, do all this. Maybe they think it's more important. But because more and more women are more independent, they don't really have to rely on men to make a living, to make money. So they actually will choose someone emotionally more supportive. So I think that is missing. I wonder, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I do want to comment. For example, when I was studying psychology in college, I was like one of 4 guys in my class. So like in all of psychology, it's just predominantly women. But also I want to point out that the hierarchy is just a ranking system. So like if you want to understand what that means, all you have to do is consider what attributes you find attractive in whatever sex it is that you're attracted to. Okay, do you want someone to have more or less of that quality? Well, by definition, you want them to have more. Well, okay, then you could take all your potential mates and rate them by who has the most and who has the least, right? And then the top ones, the ones that have the most, would be the top of that hierarchy, of that structure. So like you said, that a lot of women that, may be more independent, can provide for themselves, don't need a man to be, working and being the breadwinner, they might actually opt for emotional support. It's like, okay, but there's a hierarchy within men of men that are capable of emotional support. There's some men who are completely terrible at it, and if you come up crying, will not help you with anything at all. And then there's some men that you can talk to as though they were your best friend, and they'll be there for you and give you empathy and either give you advice or help you talk it through. But it's all a matter of the ranking system that we use. And so like the hard part is whenever we say hierarchy, it's really easy to just imagine it as one giant hierarchy having the like Mike Tyson at the top that can beat up everyone else. And it's like, that's not so much what it is. It's a matter of a system in which men will essentially compete and gauge each other and then whoever ends up at the top can be selected. So from professional acumen to physicality to psychological acumen, so like all those different qualities, you can rank order men, and essentially it's just a pecking order by a certain dimension is what you can imagine a hierarchy is. And the dominance hierarchy is dominance, but it, in us as humans, it gets so much more complex that, Peterson makes the case we've kind of switched it more to competence hierarchy. So being good at emotional support, that makes you attractive. Being good at, whatever it is that you would like a man to be.
Okay, the next one is going to be David, Brian Nelson, Jean Piero, Dave, and Brian Swint. David, go ahead.
So Roger and Victor, great presentation, and again another interesting subject that makes you think. Actually, as I was listening, I think my question and thoughts changed a little bit. And so in our breakout room, we had a very interesting discussion. And one of the comments or the question I'll ask you, Roger, is even though we've no longer, I guess, have a formal religion or structured religions as we've had in the past that gave society the context of the rules for the game, how to interact. And we have a significant upwelling of tribalism today. I mean, anything and everything appears to be being placed into tribes and tribal identification. I wonder if that structure in religion has actually been replaced, and our society is now being influenced by the new structure. We may not see it formally and obviously, but there are new rules. And some of the rules are that the rules get to change. And maybe our social media and the influences that society and is being put on society from that social media doesn't have necessarily a face, but it is influencing our society and moving it in directions that are creating the conflict that we're seeing today. And some of the conflict is because there is different rules for the game, and the rules are not obvious today. And that's creating that dynamic, if you will, of conflict and tension within, especially in this country, I guess. So your thoughts on that, Roger?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that I definitely agree. And I think both Peterson just quotes Nietzsche when he points out, because I don't know if you remember that nihilistic trap that I described in the presentation of, once you have full realization of your limitation within time and all those problems, then no matter, and you can actually lose faith in any belief structure. So no matter what belief structure you create, it collapses. But Peterson points out that that's half the story. The second half of the story is you can create other belief structures that function similar to religious structures, only he calls them like crippled religions. And that's the role of ideologies. Because essentially ideologies give you, similar to religions, a lens to which you can view the world, but without the wholeness contradiction. So religions tend to be both constantly highlight good and bad, or at least are attempting to do that, whereas ideologies tend to paint things a lot more as, for example, the environmental lens or perspective is that humans essentially are a virus, and we should really work to either contain humans in our damage as much as possible, and to the really extreme end, you end up in the same problem of like, or just kill all humans so we can save the world kind of thing. But the idea is that ideology is what's arisen in the 20th century as a replacement for the cohesive structures that religion used to provide. As far as the rules go, the main problem, I don't think, is that the rules are explicit, but that we don't share the rules anymore. We don't have the same rules anymore. So if I'm a devout communist and I'm hanging out with a libertarian and a Nazi, there's not going to be a lot of things that we can actually talk about or even interact with, because our expectations are just so different and our views are going to be so different that the expectations and norms are going to be whack. And with all that context of those subcultures, there's also the main culture, which I do think is why we currently aren't all killing each other. It's the, you know, that main American culture with its set of laws and set of expectations that we all, for the most part, regardless of our actual ideologies, can still be like, yeah, you know, that's reasonable, right? Like, that's still like fine. We might disagree with some of the specifics or certain laws or certain rules, but for the most part, we agree to play that game.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Brian Nelson, Jean Piero, Dave, Brian Swent, and Maritza. Brian Nelson, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
I chimed in for a couple reasons. I thought I was convinced I'd say nothing tonight, but I chimed in, number one, that there was kind of a pause and nobody else was chiming. And then number two, we had a great discussion. Two parts to it. Jean had already raised the first one, the role of women, which I think has evolved. And now the second one is maybe a little harder to put, but I'll just give my understanding of it. And it really ties in nicely with what Roger was just talking about. So I think this is great. I'd also appreciate if the others have something to say, because everyone spoke very articulately on this topic, and the group was about half and half, in my opinion. What are the limitations? I guess the question that I think was out there is, what are the limitations of Jordan Peterson's reflections and analysis? And some people felt, I think, that it's maybe not the best use of our time or the worthwhile. Certainly the study of the focus on the Old Testament and religion is not the best use of our time or worthwhile. And others thought, yeah, it is worthwhile. I don't think my comments are controlling, but I put out there that I did listen to all of his Old Testament and course, and my takeaway was he was trying to, if I had to use a word, trying to rehabilitate the myths from the Old Testament to give them some, the best possible contemporary meaning. So it's really, it's partly the Old Testament, and it's but partly Jordan Peterson. But then we broke off again. It was a great discussion. It kind of broke off, and one of the takeaways was, well, where we kind of were at was, we can't just rely on the Old Testament. We can't rely on the isms that Jordan Peterson also decries, which he thinks will take over if we don't rely on the religions. We need something new. And what is that new thing? I don't know what that new thing is.
Yeah.
Wonderful, Brian. That was great. Roger, would you like to respond to that? I do have stuff to say. But go ahead, please.
Oh,
Roger.
yeah. So essentially, the reason I actually really like Jordan Peterson, and it's for exactly that problem you're bringing up, Brian, is because what he's doing is he's attempting to continue Jung's work to some extent. So he's basing it a lot on Jung, but then kind of bringing a lot of his own arguments into it, especially the more evolutionary biology arguments. But the reason for all of this is there's a couple of reasons. One is to the maps of meaning. One is to inculcate you against ideological possession. In other words, if someone comes up and offers you one of those isms, right, and tells you a full map, essentially offers you a fully prepared map of what reality is and how it reacts and how it acts and how you can perceive the world, that you're able to see that that map is incomplete. That's the first reason. So a quick example is I did a little bit of debate back in college, and I was only a rookie for like the whole time I did it, but so since I was a rookie and I was still kind of learning the ropes, the one argument they gave me that I would run, and it's a canned argument, which basically means it's a file filled with different arguments, and whatever they throw at you, you just look it up, pull it out, and read it. And it's called the CAPK, which is capitalism critique. Why do you critique capitalism? Because it's literally one of the easiest cases you can make. Trade hits every aspect of life. So as long as you can associate with capitalism, you can therefore associate all the atrocities of capitalism to that. And these kind of logical loops that, you know, will get us stuck rationally within them, but it doesn't actually explain the world as much as gives us a sense that we understand it. Peterson, the idea is that Peterson's trying to provide you with the context of, for example, those 4 games as the archetypes that our psychologies have evolved to. And so whenever, for example, the criticism of capitalism or a communist perspective may sell you that capitalism is completely bad, or environmentalists may sell you that any form of development is completely bad, that you're always looking for the opposite side of the coin, that you're always looking for what is it that that is providing that you're not telling me, which you can find in almost any ideology. In almost any ideology, they're not willing to make the argument for the counter side of for their opponents, essentially. And what his point is if we look at actual religious text, not the church's doctrine, but actual religious text, and why they seem to constantly resonate and why all these traditions seem to be quite similar, it's because the ideas are more human than anything else. That's what the archetypes essentially are, is that they're descriptions of our condition, not just some, you know, fantastical myth, but rather descriptions of what it is to live, how are we supposed to deal with this, and how are we supposed to go through life. And it's a bunch of different meditations on that without any of the more worldly goals that tends to come with ideology. And that's kind of the main goal of diving into all these ancient texts. It's because we're trying to see why so many people dedicated their entire lives to it, assuming that they're not stupid, right? Assuming they weren't just stupid and uneducated and were just believing in some random stuff, which I'm sure some were, right? Plenty were. It's like, but not everyone had to. Some people really had to genuinely believe this and genuinely see value to it. And it's attempting to understand what that value is.
Okay, that's a fantastic question, Brian. So let me try to give you my take on this, because these meetups, all our meetups here at 52 Living Ideas are about this question, not particularly about Jordan Peterson, but any ideas that we are studying. The reason I like Jordan Peterson is that he brings together many fields. He brings together religion, mythology, Jung, psychological measurement, evolution, history, politics, and tries to bring it together. I think that's very, very powerful. First, I want to, but he's not the only person who does that. There are many, 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 many people who do that, okay? And we should take in all of that. Coming back to the theme of today, I mean, if you see, I'm not from this tradition. I did not grow up with Bible. So I can see something which is very odd about it. It seems like, I've never really thought the Garden of Eden to be an ideal situation. Okay, I thought it would be extremely boring to be just sitting there eating fruit. Okay, it really doesn't do anything for me. I mean, it is a animal kind of a thing. And I think a lot of the problems is in thinking about that as the ideal state and wanting to go back to that, or wanting certainty. We are fallible beings. Whatever ideas we hold, no matter how hard we work at them, those always can be wrong. And the moment you get wedded to an idea and you start despising the world because it doesn't conform to your ideas, you're sunk. So one of the solutions to that is to keep taking in ideas. So Jordan Peterson does a very good job of bringing together some fields. Let me give you some of the examples that we are working on at the meetup. So for example, Julian Jaynes, his approach to consciousness is far deeper than everything that Jordan Peterson talks about. So if you want to understand about self-consciousness, if you want to understand about language, it is along the same lines that Jordan Peterson is proceeding, but it is far deeper and far more powerful, far more applicable, where you can really become more conscious. So that's Julian Jaynes. The second direction in which we need to expand is somebody like Marshall McLuhan, who looks at different media and different ages and see how things change over time, because we are actually in the middle of a very profound change. We are just like when we moved from no language to language, spoken language, that was a massive change. From spoken language to written language, that was a massive change. From there to printing was a massive change. From there to electronic media like TV was a massive change. From there to digital is a massive change. And just the way in which we function, way in which the society functions, way in which we function as individual beings is different. We need to bring that in. We are living in the digital world. We need to understand that. And you have to take in not just that, but you have to go back and look at people like Aristotle, look at people, like the great books program of saying, okay, who has something to tell me? Does William James have something? Just does Aristotle have something? And bring all of that in and put all these ideas of all these people against one another and against your own ideas. That is the only way to actually provide the fundamental solution to this problem of falling in love with your own ideas and then despising the world, which is the root cause of all the problems that we're talking about. But fantastic question. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Giampiero, Dave, and the other Brian.
Thank you. I have 2 points, one on hierarchies and the other one on self-awareness. My understanding of hierarchies is there is no one hierarchy, but there is multiple hierarchies. And when I find myself at the bottom of a hierarchy, maybe my talents, my competencies are not good there, and I need to find and discover the hierarchy where I will shine and bring and contribute and thrive. That's my interpretation of what I've learned. As far as self-awareness, I love what was said about the price for self-awareness. And I believe that it's a price that we haven't paid in full, and actually we pay installments as we grow older. And that is work and sacrifice. And even when I work and sacrifice, that my sacrifice will not be enough. And then maybe that's a good insight for me to see where am I at in this hierarchy. And okay, am I using my natural abilities and my gifts and talents here, or should I discover someplace else where I can flourish instead of becoming resentful, nihilistic, vengeful, and murderous? And those are my takeaways. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Roger. How about this? You can, whenever you want to speak something, just unmute yourself. So I know you want to speak, so I'll call upon you. So you don't have to comment on everything. You can choose to comment on whatever you want. Okay. Next up is going to be Dave. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shikant. And wonderful presentation, Roger, as always. A couple of points, and hopefully not too far off track, but the word logos, I think we've been using as thinking, that we get the word logical from, or analytical. In some of the stuff I've been, about Genesis and the beginning of the Bible, we say in the beginning was the word, and apparently from the Greek, is that from the word is from the word logos. So like I say, this is, you know, far beyond, or getting beyond consciousness, but it seems like us communicating is a very basic skill, which probably started with, you know, a few grunts, you know, not much farther than an animal, but then pointing, gestures. And I was realizing, you know, that even the cave painting came beyond, you know, printing and writing, you know, as Shikant was talking about. But so I'd throw that in. That's a little detour. But the other thing is about the Garden of Eden. This was not in Jordan Peterson. I heard from another source that obviously man was developing in the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree of knowledge. But the question is, was God maturing? Because Adam hid from God. And the God we understand now is all seeing and all knowing. You want to think about, you know, Superman's X-ray vision. Well, if God had X-ray vision, how was Adam hiding from him? So it brought up the question about maybe God has matured as well. But anyway, another great presentation. I look forward to the future weeks. Thank you.
No, great point. And yeah, for the logos, yeah, it is definitely not just thinking. It's the logo. The reason there's a connection in the divine, according to the story or the myth, right, is because God speaks the world into being, right? So it's that process first, and then secondly, so if you notice within the Garden of Eden, there actually isn't too much of a reference of the logos necessarily within the humans. It's not till the New Testament where Jesus comes in that, you know, he is the way and the truth, and that is what gets associated with the logos. But then it is kind of a human quality that he points out that we all have. And that's why in medieval times, you a lot of times would see the tree of knowledge represented as the crucifix, as Jesus also, because that was essentially the same thing that was being transferred. And as far as the Garden of Eden, Peterson does actually talk about it in the longer lectures, and he points out that from his perspective or his interpretation, right? His interpretation of that is essentially saying that it's an indication as to the humans themselves not being quite that smart. Like they essentially become self-aware, realize they're naked, and then they hide. And, you know, God's like, really? Like, you know, I literally created everything that would be like, I know everything that's going on. Like, why are you hiding from me? But it's this idea that they're not very bright, that we're still developing as humans. So like the first thing we do when we're scared is we just hide without any actual rational processing of that. But yeah, no, great point on both.
Next up is Maritza, followed by Kevin. Maritza.
You know, in reading the materials and watching the videos for today, I keep going back, and I guess maybe for me, it's a thread I keep going back to here for the maps of meaning, is this concept of culture and of community. And, you know, in this here last chapter, the Hostile Brothers, there was more the emphasis also on an individual. And I view the Garden of Eden kind of as it's our irrational clinging to that which was safe when we were children. So what you just said, Roger, totally like jives with me. And I did hear Jordan Peterson speak about that. And it's the, you know, the concept of, you know, just when you're a kid, you kind of, they put you in a safe bubble and, you know, make sure no harm comes to you. But almost everything is decided for you. And the concept of needing a culture for certain safety measures seems like there's a juxtaposition with how do you find the correct, you know, that middle balance point for, you know, culture and individualism. You know, if this concept of sacrifice means that we have to let go of our goals and values that no longer serve us, because if we become rigid and just cling to those things that were safe or have been safe, well then, you know, those things we're clinging to can become destructive forces for us. And I actually, Shrikant, what comes to mind is the goal we discussed yesterday, to improve our capacity for independent action, right? And that's a quote for those of you who weren't there yesterday from John Boyd. And it's fascinating to me to see the overlay of several of like an entirely different concept, but it's not. It's the same concept, because basically what it's saying, I feel like Jordan Peterson is telling us both that we need people and we have to reject groups, but it's not an all or nothing. It's also that you have to destroy and then recreate, destroy and recreate. And that's what I think we're being told here with all these repetitive myth stories of, it's brothers who basically they destroy a situation, and but in all of them, nothing is fully lost. So I keep seeing the thread of, to me, I think that somewhere in here, there's also this plea for us to find that path, where to find some kind of way to embrace a culture aspect, but an fierce admonition to not to do so at the expense of our own individuality. Thank you.
No, yeah, and well, because since Peterson borrows a lot from Jung, he really, and I think I can't remember what we mentioned. Oh, because of the snake, the idea of rebirth, that constantly that metaphor works for us, and essentially that's going to be the conclusion. So keep an eye out for it. But the conclusion for Maps of Meaning is that one of the ways to essentially be able to do what it is you're talking about, being able to collapse your map, descend into chaos, attain new information, reformulate a new map that functions better, and it's a constant cycle, is that you don't identify with the map or even with your own values, but you identify with the thing that transcends and does the process of it. So even if you completely change as a completely different person and come back with completely new values, you are still you, and that's what you're identifying with, right? And this is very Jungian idea. It's the idea. And to your point about the culture versus individual, that's kind of the whole idea of Jung and individuation, is that as you're developing, parts of you are going to be shut down by you, by culture, by society, by nature, right? There are parts of you that just cannot exist at that time when you're developing. And then after that, first you are cultured and then you are socialized. Once you are socialized, you then even more gets repressed, right? And then once you've developed to the point where you're capable, once you're an adult and you can actually manage on your own without anyone helping you, then you have to go back to your childhood and find the child that you left behind, find all the things that were dropped off. And that's essentially the Jungian shadow, right? It's all the things that you couldn't be. If you're a man, at least, until very recently, you weren't allowed to express anything that was that feminine, and that's your anima, right? There's a lot of things that, would be the Freudian id, the things that you want that aren't socially acceptable. So maybe you have sexual desires for things that you maybe shouldn't have, or that society has deemed that you shouldn't have. And those you need to go back and explore those. So it's this idea of having your cake and eating it too, through a lot of work of being fully cultured, knowing what the rules are, knowing how to navigate that space, and then going back and exploring the things that were lost to then also have those too. And that's kind of the Jungian solution that Peterson subscribes to.
Excellent. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My understanding is become a self is like what I am now to what I want to be in the future. Yes, one is I want to take away is let's use the word, use a neutral way to understand the word self. For example, hierarchy self, right? By nature, it help us try understand the world. We can generally use 3 layers to interpret our world from one side, another side, middle to yourself or your belief. We can easily also draw the house loop, use this hierarchy, just house loop is circular. It's about connection, relationship. Another take is let's value the diversity, keep the tolerance of ambiguity, and learn from multiple perspective. We all can draw the map of meaning for ourselves. We can evaluate our own faith, belief, and learn from others. That's my take. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is David S. David, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to kind of point back to something I think you were saying, Srikant, and then actually, I forget who was earlier talked about, should we look at Bible and what's the value of this particular topic, or Jordan Peterson per se, that actually taking something specific like this and gathering interactively and then challenging ourselves as we speak and really do our analysis to each other, and then listening to that, interpreting, using that was such a rich starting point, something that has so many sides to it as the central idea, and making that our topic. Here, it's a little bit like doing a religious or cultural use of the myths, the stories themselves. And, these are these important stories in Westerns. Okay, but it's actually grappling with them. That's the important thing, is seeing, well, isn't this the ideal place? Or maybe it isn't the ideal place. Oh, look, then maybe that's a more grown up way of looking at it. And, seeing the dark side of it at the same time. So it's a dialectic of values that we're developing, because we're each coming in and opening up and challenging each other in allowing that to happen, and saying, well, I see the opposite thing here. So, the world is made for us, the human being. We're the highest form of life. We return to dust, and that's what we're made out of. That's what we were made out of in the first place. It's like, hold that contradiction while you live, because you want to inculcate these possibilities of thinking, the possibilities into your life, to be inculcated, to be open to that, right? To have gratitude for being able, so these stories can do that, but they also, inculcate a certain pride, so you can feel connected to the divine. That's the story. You're made in the image, the very shadow of, but then again, knocked right down. So I think the net result is we accept each other, and this is a demonstration of resilience and questioning at the same time. So there's a self-development. Self-consciousness is what we're committing to. So having all these different places we touch and saying there's some depth here that has, like you said, there's some real depth. These people aren't just dummies because they didn't have, the fusion reactors, yet look how close we are. No, it's depth of life and human. So I think that sort of lets us approach these with some respect, and even maybe with a feeling of sanctity to the process of coming together. This is sort of like a religious thing to do this. It's a soul issue. Yeah.
That was beautiful, David. And I would say that, just to add to that, especially to that note of that religious practice, it's essentially Peterson's belief that he's a worshiper of the logos, which is kind of what he describes that, which, as David pointed out, it's this other David, as the other David had pointed out, is essentially conceptualized as God and the spoken truth. And the idea is that what we're engaging in right now, and even more just like in the breakout rooms, is one person is trying to articulate as best as they can what they genuinely believe. And then other people are listening to that and comparing that map to their map. And if there's a mismatch, they then articulate their truths. And then what we're doing is we're sharing information to be like, hey, okay, I believe it because of this. It's like, yeah, well, I believe this because of this. It's like, okay, yeah, I don't believe that, but that is a good point, and I'm going to remember that. And like, now both of us have improved our maps, right? Without having to really destroy or collapse it. But it's almost a religious, if it's not a religious act, it's at least a therapeutic one, right? Because it allows us to attain information without having to, have the anomalous event occur. We can learn from each other and improve our own capacity for thinking and rationalizing. So yeah, great, well said.
Yeah, that was amazing point. Absolutely true. I mean, see, there are several points I want to make. Firstly, we are starting with these myths, these stories. These are very powerful stories because they capture something fundamental about human beings. And those are the stories we are focusing on, and the richness and the depth and the breadth of the observations captured in these stories is amazing. Secondly, I have to say that, I listened to Jordan Peterson's presentation just before the meetup started. And I think Roger and Victor are doing a fantastic job of actually putting things down on the table for us in far greater, kind of range and connections, on the top of whatever Jordan Peterson is doing. So these are fantastic actual, presentations. And what that does is that it gets the conversation started, because ultimately the most glorious thing that is happening is within each of us when we engage in discussions. Okay, that is really what these meetups are about, of us becoming a little bit more self-conscious, a little bit more aware of our limitations, a little bit more aware of different ways of looking at things, little bit correcting wherever we are wrong, and doing that in a fairly compact time frame. Usually you would bang into life and learn, and you will learn when you bang into life. But this is a way of doing kind of simulation, of actually learning a little bit from each other, that will save us some time and open up possibilities which we have closed, because all of us are subject to biases. We do fall in love with our own creations. Okay, and that is the heart of the problem. And so firstly, it is the stories. Second is the discussion. Also, there is a certain ethos that is there in our discussions. All of us now pretty much have it. Occasionally, few new people who come in, they don't have the ethos, and they find it to be not really their kind of stuff. But most of the people who keep coming back have that ethos of, number one, saying that I can speak my mind, I can disagree with people. At the same time, I will listen to other people. I will closely listen. Whether I disagree or agree, I will listen to them, see what they are saying, and then decide what I think. And so all of this is, I think, very special. And David, thanks for putting that. And I think one of the results of it is the word that you use is resilience, because life keeps changing, and there is a lot of things that we don't know. So there is a lot of chaos out there, and it's a question, again, was what Marisa was talking about, Boyd, or Roger was talking about the process. It's really the process that matters. Your current maps don't matter. Those are going to change over time. Your current reality that is around you doesn't matter. That's also going to change. So to keep that process, which is an open system, which is self-correcting and adapting continuously. And I think all of us are helping each other do that. And I think it's just incredibly beautiful. All right, let's see. Somebody else had something. Let me see who it was. Have I covered everybody? Does anybody else have anything to say? All right, Roger, what's coming up next?
Yeah, so as I had mentioned earlier, essentially these we're 3 out of 4 in for this one lecture that got cut up into 30 minutes. So this whole time, Peterson's slowly been building the case for what we ended on today, which was, why is evil? One, why does evil exist? What is it? And why do people choose to do it? And we wanted to end today kind of on the logical rationale of, if you take a certain interpretation of the world, the rationality then takes you the rest of the way, all the way to hell, right? All the way to, well, if life really is this terrible and there is no other meaning behind it, why would I stay here? Or worse, why should this game even continue at all? I should just try to kill as many people as possible, because this is just a farce. And from there, we're going to then build to some of the more darker sides of humanity and why and how we defend against that.